Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm your host, Mark the Liberty, and joining me today is
Corey Total Bust Knockreiner. Apparently I'm as bad as some ZTNA products.
Definitely have zero trust in you, that's for sure.
Oh, thanks. This is why we make great co-hosts.
On today's episode, we'll discuss a DefCon talk called ZeroTrust Total Bust and some of the key findings from it. After that, we'll discuss a recent vulnerability in FortiWeb's WAF appliance, FortiGate's, FortiNet's WAF appliance. Man, it's tough when it's just literally Forti everything.
I'm hungry. I need to get a Forti spoon and have my Forti lunch before I
run over
don't
by,
care anymore.
Forti truck. And then we will end with a quick update from Google's Project Zero team on their new vulnerability disclosure policy, I suppose. And with that, let's go ahead and Forti start this episode.
Wow. Thank you. I think we need a sponsorship. I think they owe us some money for name dropping them so much, considering they're competitors. Hopefully everyone knows we're name dropping them ironically.
So Corey, for this first story, I found it because of a news article because I had a conflict and didn't make it to DefCon this year, which is a bit heartbreaking since it looks like I missed some interesting stuff.
To be fair, none of us technically did. I only caught some of it because I went on my personal time. But yeah, it was heartbreaking for the whole team to miss DefCon this year.
But like this one stood out to me mostly because the attention grabbing name for it, which was ZeroTrust Total Bust.
Total Bust. Yeah.
Because I'm personally like all aboard the ZeroTrust train, even recognizing that train has a very long track to get to the end. But this one stood out because they're basically throwing out a bunch of issues in some ZTNA providers. But I was going to intro this one, but I think you attended this talk, didn't you, Corey?
Yeah, I went to a number of the talks, including this one. It was related to ZeroTrust and something we're doing at WatchGuard, so thought it was worth looking at.
So maybe, Corey, do you want to take it from here and talk about like what they went over, and then we can discuss some of the findings they had?
Yeah, for sure. So the organization behind these researchers is AmberWolf. And as you mentioned, the talk was called ZeroTrust Total Bust. Just for a little background, these researchers actually have been known for finding vulnerabilities in VPN, classic VPN things, quite a few vulnerabilities. So they're really known for these kind of remote access VPN vulnerabilities. And after their last big, I think they presented at Nacho VPN once, or at Sans Hollywood Hackfest. But they, after the VPN thing, one question they said they got a lot was, what about ZTNA? The two speakers, because I was there by myself, I wasn't actually taking notes for work, but I don't remember their names, but their aliases are Buffer Overflow and Johnny Spandex. Those were the primary guys talking. And they started by going over what ZTNA is and how it's supposed to be a disruptor for VPN, talking a little bit about some buzzwords like SASE, traffic steering, and identity providers, just so everyone understood a bit about how Zero Trust network access is different. But then they started looking into, is this really Zero Trust? And long story short, it was really just a talk that was listing vulnerabilities after vulnerabilities in a number of well-known ZTNA products coming from Checkpoint, Zscaler, or as these UK-based people call it, Zscaler and Netscope. And really, every single type of vulnerability you could think about. They started with auth bypasses. When you're authenticating to these Zero Trust services, there is an IDP. By the way, once you get to the IDP, it's just a yes or no answer. One of the comments they made when they were defining IDP was the IDP was doing fine. There's nothing wrong with what the IDP was doing, but most of these issues had to do with the SAML implementation of getting that IDP authentication. So they found auth bypasses, steering bypasses, traffic steering bypasses, where you might be able to make traffic go outside the ZTNA product, config theft, where you could get the configuration file from Zscaler and Netscope products, etc. And then privileged, more device related or client related vulnerabilities like privilege escalations and things like posture bypass. Like if a ZTNA client is trying to block you from websites or not allowing you to access certain resources on the internet, how to bypass those. So at the highest level, I mean, we should go through each of the vulnerabilities you want to talk about here, but it was really looking at Checkpoint, Netscope, and Zscaler devices and finding all these flaws. And the long story short is they had this kind of checklist card of these vulnerabilities. I'll show some screens soon. It's hard to recall the talk while navigating that, but they pretty much found every single vulnerability they were looking for quite easily. Most of the ones they shared, they showed even proof of concept with video and got the classic DefCon claps for it. Some of them, they outlined the idea of what a vulnerability would be, but they're still not patched. So they had to not share the full details or outline it. So there's still more to come. But the long story short is for Zero Trust, you really have to not trust the user and the device that's connecting even. So a lot of their takeaways was to have Zero Trust, you really have to, first of all, really secure the authentication and authorization processes so they actually work. But on top of that, you can't trust the client itself. So you have to put a lot of hardening, whether that be anti-tampering protection or other things, into the client to make sure hackers or users can't bypass it there. But the devil's in the details. I'm not sure if there's anything specific you want to talk about it on it, Mark. Let's dive in.
Maybe just a couple of the vulnerabilities. Like the Netscope ones were interesting, mostly because they talked about some of like the legacy authentication and enrollment methods that Netscope used to support, or still does support, I guess is the problem. And even though after they discovered a couple of vulnerabilities like a year ago in Netscope, they haven't fully like blocked access from this, what they call IDP enrollment mode. But there were like two issues they found in this mode where attackers, if they know this organization key that cannot be rotated for the tenant, is like permanently hard coded, they can basically authenticate as any arbitrary user. And they found some pretty trivial ways to leak the org key if you have SAML access to the device, because it's actually passed as a parameter in the SAML redirect to the IDP. So that was an interesting one. The Zscaler one, though, is the one I wanted to talk about because it was a pretty big vulnerability and felt like a kind of trivial one to have in a product like this. Not to throw stones like it can and would happen to anyone, but for the Zscaler one, so it's a full SAML authentication bypass vulnerability that they just resolved on August 4th of this year. Where the issue was, so if you set up SAML authentication when you're configuring it, you have to provide a certificate for your identity provider into this application. And it lets the application validate that when it gets a signed assertion from that provider, checks it against the certificate to make sure that it actually came from that provider. It's a way to validate the trust or validate the identity of it. But the researchers from AmberWolf found that when the Zscaler service received a SAML assertion, it just checked if it was signed, period. It didn't actually validate that it was signed by that certificate, which is a pretty big issue, because then an attacker could forge just any assertion signed by any certificate or key, and it would accept it as truth and authenticate that user. Thankfully, like Zscaler, I think they said they patched it in like 4 hours after reporting it.
Yeah, they patched this one quick.
Pretty dang good response in terms of vulnerability management. So like hats off to Zscaler on that one.
I remember laughing during the presentation because something that you might be seeing on the screen now that has like the guy that pats you down at say you're going to a football or soccer game, just barely kind of touched the people's arms and sides and didn't actually pat them down to look for anything bad. It is pretty much that, right? If you're saying this token you've given someone is part of the auto enrollment, but you're not really paying attention to anything about, is it the right username? Is it the right device? And just saying yes to everything as long as it has this token. So I do remember that one. And the GIF made me, the animated GIF, whatever you want to call it, made me laugh. Not
That
only,
is
by the
awesome.
way, they did fix it in 4 hours, but it's funny that they immediately unfixed it by accident. They apparently said they had to roll it. They had another critical issue and had to temporarily roll it back, but they fixed it again. So yeah, it was a quick fix. I will say one good takeaway when you're talking about there's server side in the ZTNA, a lot of it's server side. All the real action happens on the server side and the POPs because you're really going through a cloud service when you're using the ZTNA product. There's obviously some client side stuff. But the one good thing about ZTNA flaws, at least the server side ones, is they can be fixed quickly by the vendor without users taking action in many cases. It's more some of the client side ones that you need to worry about. This wasn't the only, if I remember right, the Zscaler SAML authentication bypass was in their kind of auto enrollment process. And there were other issues and other vendors in this enrollment process. And one of the fixes, though, one of the things they said is you also have to communicate your fixes, because one of the fixes didn't actually kill the core issue because it had to exist, but you had to turn on some sort of, they made a new setting called more secure enrollment default rather than optional. And you had to have that setting turned on in order to not have this happen. And even after the patch came out and things were fixed, the team at AmberWolf found that a lot of people still had not enabled the more secure enrollment option. So anyways, go ahead.
It's an interesting philosophical thing. Like one of the tenets of secure by default is that the more secure option is always enabled by default, period. I wonder if this was, I don't know the details. Did this new more secure default option come like later? Like,
it became default, yes. I think it was there when they. I don't know if it was available from the beginning. Okay. I think the option was there when they published the or at least reported the vulnerability, but I know it wasn't default as an option when they published the vulnerability. So one of the core parts of the fix was them changing it from being a default. But to your point, did you do enough secure design to even consider this in the first place and have it? I don't recall if they didn't have it until after this. I just know that it changed to being a default requirement or a default option turned on after the reporting.
Because it feels like, I mean, if you have two options, one's more secure than the other, the more secure should always be the default. And you should give a loosening guide. Like if you want to use the less secure one, here is the actual security impact of doing it. But
which is something we're moving towards for, some of the secured, what is the US one where they're doing more IoT secure design in the US. Yeah. Softening guides, not hardening guides.
And then the last one, the checkpoint vulnerability, was interesting on its own too. Basically, it looks like the checkpoint connection client has a connection to an SFTP server to be able to put logs in there, probably for troubleshooting. And the key to authenticate to that server was hard-coded into the application so it could connect. So the researchers were able to extract that key, go log into the SFTP server. And it turns out the logs were pretty verbose. It even included authentication material, JSON web tokens. So kind of big deal there. And a good example of when your troubleshooting feature within the device can actually bite you if you don't consider the attacker's access to it also.
Yeah, and by the way, I just want to point out that AmberWolf was really good at putting up their blog post on this at GitHub on this. But one of the things I like about DefCon over Black Hat is you can often watch all of the talk. So if you actually want to watch this talk yourself, crazy. And you picked, probably because of the article you read, you picked 2 flaws. There have to be 8 different flaws in this talk. There's all kinds of, I didn't really pay attention to which 2 you picked, Mark, before we had the podcast, but there really are a lot in this talk.
That's awesome.
Highly recommend you check it out. They do the classic, they do have, they use Python to actually exploit them and show it. So good thing to know. And by the way, for us, at the end, they do have mitigations and learnings that I think that folks can do. I love their comic, by the way. ZTNA means don't trust users or devices, but the question is, can you trust the vendor? But they have learnings. But I think part of why I wanted to see this talk and you and I are paying attention to it is the vendor learnings. There's lots of stuff we can learn from the mitigations from this talk. So we are going to take that back to look at our own ZTNA client and make sure that we don't do some of the same things.
Yep. Cool thing is we already handed off all this research to our red team to start having a go at it also. This is one thing I love about DefCon talks. It's just inspiration for potential findings in any service, but especially our own. But yeah, either way, pretty cool talk, and definitely worth watching the video of the actual recording.
And many
too.
more, by the way. Again, the good thing about DefCon, even though it's sad that we didn't go, any of you can go online and DefCon, if you go even to the defcon.org, their media URL usually has links to any of the video talks that they make public. And I think they make most of them public via Vimeo and YouTube nowadays.
It's awesome. So I guess moving on then to the second story. A researcher going by the handle OX so Nullbyte Shack, published information on a new vulnerability in the FortiWeb web application firewall last week. They even gave it a pretty cute name, Fort Majeure, a play on force majeure, I assume. So they got a CVE at CVE 2025-52970 for an authentication bypass vulnerability in the admin interface of the FortiWeb WAF system. Pausing for a second, this is in the management interface for it, the admin interface, which should never be exposed to the internet for any security device, WAF, firewall, anything.
I wonder how many times we've said that, Mark.
Yes. But if yours is exposed to the internet, the flaw is actually pretty serious. So it's an issue in the authentication cookie parsing code. Basically, all of your requests to the server include this cryptographically signed authentication cookie that includes information like your username and role, so your permissions. The cookie is made up of 3 different parts. There's a field called era, which should be either 0 or 1. Basically, at some point, they updated their formatting for their cookie. This field tells the FortiWeb service like which format to use for the cookie. The second field is the actual payload. It's the encoded data for your session, like username, role, whatever. And then the third field is a auth hash, so a cryptographic hash of that payload signed by the secret owned by FortiWeb. Basically, so you can't just go in and toggle values in that payload and just have it accept it as is. But during cookie parsing, the system does a couple of things. So first off, it selects a key out of memory based off of the value of that era field. So if it's 0, it grabs one key. If it's 1, it grabs a different key. It then decrypts the payload using that selected key, and it verifies the auth hash using that same key and the cipher hash or the ciphertext then. So there's only 2 expected values of that key, but the issue is the code doesn't actually validate that number provided in era.
0 or
so
1,
the attacker,
yeah, we said it.
Yep. The attacker can supply a cookie with era of anything 0 through 9. And if it gives it something like 2 through 9, the backend will end up reading just uninitialized memory, which ends up giving it a 0 or like a nulled out key for that encryption and the HMAC signing. Basically,
all
long
good.
story. Yeah,
Yay,
exactly.
you're authenticated. Sorry.
Long story short, it means the attacker can always predict what that key is going to be and just forge their own authentication cookies. There are a couple of limitations. So there's a field within that authentication header that's an unknown number, but the number is generally something pretty low. The researcher said it's usually between 0 and 30. So pretty quick to brute force that one.
I think I could actually brute force that without a computer.
Even me,
even in my brain.
I'm going to say, guarantee you could.
Oh, wait,
I don't know.
I only have 20 fingers and toes. I guess I'm out of luck. I'm not going to be able to do it.
Bummer. The second limitation is a bit more of an impactful one. So the attacker has to know a valid username and that user has to have a active session while the exploit is running. So
Having
there
an
is a
active session cookie.
yeah, there is a bit of a condition in there. But like if all that pans out, if the attacker knows the username, that user is currently logged in, at that point it is trivial to basically brute force a valid cookie and do whatever you want in the context of that particular user. Good news is it's patched. So if you've got a FortiWeb device, go update to the latest version. It looks like version 8.0 is just straight up not affected, but the other ones have received security updates.
Good to know the thing protecting my web applications is so good at web application protection.
I mean, it happens. Yeah,
I know I'm not throwing me. You know our policy, even our competitors, everyone makes mistakes. It's about how you fix them. I couldn't help throwing a little shade.
But this feels like another good example of why like unsafe memory programming languages, like presumably this was written in C or C++ based off the issue, like why that can cause an issue, because you can just go access uninitialized memory in this case and get yourself a key that's just all zeros.
It's going to take a long time. I think we all want non-memory safe coding languages to go away, but we have many decades of applications that are programmed in Pascal and C and C++, and hopefully soon.
Hopefully soon.
I don't know. Now that administrations have changed, is secure by design even a thing anymore?
It is still a thing. There's just no one actually promoting it anymore, unfortunately. But either way, like interesting research. This is actually a follow-up. They had another vulnerability they found way back in February in FortiWeb. And it turns out they tweeted out after they found it like an MD5, like a hash of the vulnerability to prove that they were the first ones to find it. But they said they were sitting on it while waiting for their other research. And unfortunately, someone else reported it at time window. But they submitted
But at least
hash.
if the hash meant, if that matched, they can prove that they actually cryptographically that.
Yeah.
Although I guess that it only proves that they had some, unless they made the hash based on the write-up they had already. That hash just proves they were going to disclose something and they weren't lying. But I guess if the hash perfectly matches, say, the research paper they already wrote on it.
It matches the exploit code for the actual vulnerability.
It matched the code. Oh, that's smart. That's smart. So it does prove it's the exact vulnerability.
They sent it to Fortinet later, like around this time frame, and I think in July, to try and get their own credit added, basically saying, "Hey, look, I found it back in February."
I wonder how bug bounties would. I guess it depends if they had reported yet.
Yeah, you would have to have reported it, and they only found it in that case. But pretty interesting. This researcher does a lot of good work on finding authentication bypass issues in web apps. So definitely one that I follow on a regular basis.
I can tell by their blog they definitely have a dark sense of humor, which I like. So
yes, they do. Moving on to the last story, though, and speaking, I guess, of vulnerability research. So we've talked a lot over the years of findings from Google Project Zero. They've been around for more than a decade now. It's a team at Google that their whole job is just to go find and disclose responsibly zero-day vulnerabilities in hardware and software products. And their main focus is usually like the foundational upstream technologies. So they mention like chipsets and their drivers are two big ones. They also do a lot of work in like open source as well too. Basically the things that other downstream vendors use in order to build their products on top of. And their vulnerability disclosure policy, it's generally like the standard that most organizations follow. So since 2021, they've operated under this 90+30 policy. Basically, they give vendors 90 days to fix the issue. If they fix it within that window, they get an additional 30-day extension for patch adoption before Google discloses their information about the issue. That's what most vendors follow. That's what we follow internally at WatchGuard too, or at least what we expect out of the researchers we work with. But they 2 weeks ago, they just announced a small change to this policy to help solve an issue that they've called the upstream patch gap. Basically, a patch gap is that time between when a fix is available and when the users install the relevant update. And even with just like let's say a vulnerability in any given software you have, like when you get notified there's an issue, you don't just instantly have it resolved. You have to generally go find that, first off, get the notification, then go download, test, and install that update. And that could be hours, days, weeks, in some cases, a very long time that your device is vulnerable after that patch is now available. And it only gets more critical when the vulnerability is in a upstream component, where now, yes, it's fixed in, like, let's say OpenSSL, but now you have to wait for everyone that uses that to update their implementation and then release updates for their products too.
To put
I
it
think
differently, a little differently, and this is maybe where obviously the researchers always want to disclose as quickly as possible. But in their defense, and I think part of why you built this up is Project Zero really paying attention to big upstream systems, cloud production systems. It's sure if you find a vulnerability in WinRAR, as soon as WinRAR releases a patch, there's really very little excuse for any client to just go update it. Bam, you're done. So the researcher might think, I don't need much time for that. Anyone can patch the client right away. What's the big freaking deal? Maybe I need a week for communication. But when you have a production cloud system where OpenSSH might be in the back end all over the freaking place, and these are for multi-million-dollar, scaled, public cloud systems that are elastically going up and down, testing that OpenSSH patch and really planning a deployment of it is a really big deal. It's not, as much as you want to patch things immediately, there are lots of little issues with it when you don't want a complex system that the entire world sometimes relies on to go down. So I think that's kind of what you're talking about by the upstream and by the nature of needing a little more time to really roll out some of these patches that I think researchers need to pay attention to.
I think a good example of the upstream patch gap, like in reality, was the Log4Shell vulnerability.
Oh yeah.
Remember, it was a massively critical vulnerability in the Log4j library used by most, if not all, Java-based tools. And even after that flaw was fixed, those tools still had to pick up the patch and then release their own updates, and we still have vulnerable Java apps floating around.
And I was even talking about public cloud in production, but then you have things that are hard-coded in IoT firmware that doesn't have this automated patch cycle that is going to take, how people are paying attention to firmware of the little freaking TikTok web camera they have sitting in their house. To really even get through the entire supply chain, which can include tons of hardware manufacturers, it may take months. So yeah, it's a great example, Mark.
And part of the problem is those downstream dependents, those hardware manufacturers, the software vendors, oftentimes they don't even find out about the vulnerability until it is patched and disclosed by that upstream maintainer for it. So there's always going to be a gap in that case if they're not even finding out until hour zero.
Way later. Yeah.
So Google is trying to shrink this gap by introducing a new policy that they're calling reporting transparency. Basically, it boils down to within 1 week of reporting a vulnerability to a vendor, Google will publicly share that a vulnerability was discovered. And the report's going to be pretty light. It's not going to give away all the details or really any details about it. The report just includes the vendor or open source project that received the report, the affected product, and the date the report was either fixed or when that 90-day disclosure deadline expires.
I would say this is kind of similar to pre-populating a CV, wouldn't you, Mark? If you're a CNA and here at WatchGuard, we might know there's a new vulnerability, but we're not quite near patching it. We might actually already create a CVE for it, and that generates a page that says, hey, there's something coming. But we don't release a whole lot of detail for it then. Would you say that's kind of similar?
Similar in that when you reserve a CVE, all it shows is that a CVE was reserved. It doesn't have any vendor information at all.
A little more. Yeah.
This would be if we said WatchGuard reserved a CVE for the Firebox, for example. And that is it. That is the extent of it. And so it doesn't give you enough to understand really anything about the vulnerability, but it does at least notify everyone that might be paying attention that they need to pay attention because there's going to be a fix for their tool coming at some point. I think another good example of where this kind of comes is OpenSSL, for example. They do a pretty good job of sending an email to their mailing list 2 weeks early before a update is coming out. and they just say, hey, we're releasing an update on this date. There is at most a high or a critical severity issue in it, so that you can prepare to know, okay, I need engineering engaged to review it as soon as it's available and hopefully crank out an update as quickly as possible. So it's like an early warning system, I guess, that something is coming and pay attention.
By the way, I don't hate this, but if I'm trying to be a devil's advocate to it, I wonder if it will also stir up public attention that will distract vendors from actually being able to concentrate on the patch that is specifically not yet made. And by that, I mean for the industry, not for the actual customer and the end user. Let's say you have this flaw directly in something you use. That makes you a end user of it. You may not need to know 2 months ahead that a patch is coming, because you're not in the situation where you're part of this up or downstream supply chain that has to prepare for it. But by doing this, you're now going to have customers that see, oh, the firebox has something coming, and then they start nagging the vendor over, what is this? What should I do? But what is this? And that then is the vendor's like, we know we have an additional, what would that be, 83 days left to do this, and we're handling it. Can you leave us alone until we give you the communication? So that's my only devil's advocate question to you. Do you think this might start to generate distracting queries based on this new information that turn into lots of rumor? We've seen how people and mobs can build each other up on the internet when there's an unanswered question. Shoot, even in the Sonic Wall situation recently, which some people thought it was an old vulnerability that was used to get credentials. Some people think there's a new 0-day, which still hasn't surfaced, and it will just cause rumors. And what do you think?
As a vendor that handles those communications, or someone at a vendor that handles, I am a little worried about like people asking questions that they don't even know what they're trying to ask for it and wasting people's time. You're right. I think like what we'll do as a vendor to handle this is just make sure our public facing policy, which we have, by the way, pcert.watchguard.com has our public vulnerability responsible disclosure policy. I think those policies just need to be very clear on like how we handle these situations. Like we can acknowledge that we've received a report and that we're investigating it and leave it at that. And as long as the policy reflects that, that will be the expectation people have, I think. But what I like that they're leaving it at is just like the vendor and the product affected and like some key dates. I'm glad they didn't go into details about like what component is affected, because that could tip off an attacker. And depending on like the size of the customer base for the component or the products and stuff, like it could incentivize them to start go digging and find that vulnerability before it is patched and turned into an actively exploited 0-day.
Agree.
So I think I welcome this policy change. I think it's also like bringing us closer to where the future for vulnerability, like what do they call it? Radical transparency and vulnerability disclosures is going. It's something that we at WatchGuard are fully prepared to handle, but I like the small update in this case just to try and make some meaningful change. They did note this is a trial run. They might roll back this new policy edition if it doesn't actually improve anything. But hey, it's nice seeing something change.
And like you say, I'm for the radical as a company that pays attention to it. I would like to see customers kind of judge the vendors they go with based on this. Are you with a company that actually shares a lot of information, that has a published PCERT policy that supports these kind of rules? Because I tell you what, if you are, they are more likely to give a crap about security and actually want to do something about it. You know, no one's going to be transparent if they think there's skeletons in their closet. So I would be skeptical of any company that does anything to try to hide or doesn't follow policies like this and thinks it's better just not to tell anyone until they're ready. And when they're ready, not really share any details.
Yep.
Communication will help everyone get more secure.
And like that is one of the notes, just to end with, that they had in their little blog post for this. They're trying to foster even better communication between like these upstream software component vendors and then like the people that use it too. Because that is important to help protect security for everyone.
It's funny. I think we've talked about this before. I don't know about, I think I can speak for you two that I got into security because I'm a nerdy technical person that likes the technical aspects of even hacking. But the further up I get in security, I realize that technical people, if they spend time on it, can figure out the technical part. That's not the hard part. It's all about communication. It's all about whether that's changing behavior, getting people to patch, getting people to listen when something is important. The higher up in security you move, the more you realize it really is about good communication and getting people on board and giving them the information they need to make risk management decisions. It's less about all the technical controls. And I mean, it should be less about all the technical controls because those should be obvious if you have the experience.
Yeah, well said. I feel like I was tricked somewhere along the line.
I keep on telling you, the CISO office is going to change all the fun stuff you do, Mark.
Yeah, it already is. That's okay. Hey, everyone. Thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future episode topics, or if you just want Corey to stop using the stupid macOS emojis if you're watching this on video, you can reach out to us on Blue Sky. I'm at itsmark.me. Corey's at SecAdept. And the both of us are on Instagram at watchguard_technologies. Thanks again for listening, and you will hear from us next week.